Captain Laura West wasn't one for grand statements. Her uniform of choice consisted of faded BDUs and well-worn combat boots, a duffel bag slung casually over her shoulder as she walked through the gates of Fort Blackhawk, just like any other morning. Yet, when Lieutenant Shane Bishop barely spared a glance at her weathered fatigues before barking an order for her to remove them, claiming she had no right to wear what she hadn't earned, Laura simply turned to comply without a word of protest. As she pulled off her jacket in the unforgiving Texas heat, the fabric lifted just enough to reveal the intricate tattoo sprawling across her shoulders. It was a combat medic cross, beautifully entwined with angel wings, accompanied by the precise date, March 7th, 2009. The sight of it made every soldier within view freeze in an instant, a silent jolt of recognition passing through them. This wasn't some casual parlor ink. It was a mark earned on the bloodiest day in Afghanistan, a testament to one woman's hands holding the precarious line between life and death for 23 wounded warriors. It was an act that had cemented her legend, a status the Army officially kept classified, yet a tattoo that every special operations veteran understood, revered, and in a way, feared. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Eagle Point, Texas, casting long, stark shadows across the rugged desert landscape as Laura West guided her weathered pickup truck toward Fort Blackhawk. The radio crackled softly with country music and static, but she kept the volume low, preferring the steady hum of tires on asphalt and the familiar, comforting weight of silence that had become her constant companion over the past 3 years. At 42, Laura moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst the world could throw at her and had, against all odds, managed to keep moving forward. Her hands, scarred but remarkably steady, gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the final stretch of highway leading to the base. The landscape here was a relentless expanse of dust and scrub brush, occasionally punctuated by a determined mesquite tree that had somehow found purchase in the unforgiving soil. It evoked memories of other places, even hotter places, where the stakes were measured in heartbeats, and the margin for error simply didn't exist. Laura had dressed deliberately that morning, choosing the faded BDUs that had been her constant through countless training exercises and grueling field operations. The fabric, soft from years of washing, its colors muted by sun and time, carried a story in every crease and fade mark. Her combat boots, resoled twice, but still incredibly solid, bore the scuff marks of 1,000 miles walked in service to something far larger than herself. She wore no rank insignia, no unit patches. Those belonged to her past, carefully folded away in a footlocker that hadn't seen the light of day in months. The invitation to return to Fort Blackhawk had arrived through official channels, bearing the signature of Sergeant Major Gloria Ramos and personally endorsed by Colonel Robert Chase himself. The Army, it seemed, was in urgent need of experienced medics to assist with advanced trauma training for the new generation of combat medics, and Laura's name had somehow surfaced from the depths of personnel files that most people assumed had been permanently sealed. She had hesitated for weeks before accepting, knowing that returning to any military installation would require her to navigate the complex landscape of active duty protocol while meticulously maintaining her civilian status. As the formidable gates of Fort Blackhawk came into view, Laura felt the familiar tightness in her chest, a sensation that always accompanied her return to military installations. The guards at the checkpoint were young, likely born after she had already been deployed to her first combat zone. They scrutinized her civilian contractor credentials with the thoroughness of soldiers who took their responsibility profoundly seriously. Yet she could discern the unspoken questions in their eyes as they noted the stark contrast between her professional demeanor and her current civilian status. The base itself, sprawled across several hundred acres of Texas prairie, a vast complex of low-slung buildings and state-of-the-art training facilities, all meticulously designed to prepare soldiers for the harsh realities of modern warfare. Laura had been here before, years ago, when it was still under construction and the ambitious dreams of what it could become were still taking shape in the minds of planners and architects. Now, it stood as a powerful testament to the military's unwavering commitment to training excellence, complete with cutting-edge medical facilities and sophisticated simulation centers capable of replicating virtually any combat environment. She parked her truck in the visitors section, observing the neat rows of government, vehicles, and personal cars that spoke volumes about the orderly life of a military community. A group of young soldiers jogged past in perfect formation, their synchronized cadence echoing off the concrete buildings as their sergeant barked out precise instructions. Laura watched them for a moment, her mind drifting back to her own early days as a young medic, learning to meticulously balance the rigorous demands of military discipline with the life-or-death responsibilities inherent in battlefield medicine. The administrative building where she needed to check in was a modern structure of steel and glass, meticulously designed to project an aura of efficiency and authority. Laura approached the main entrance, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, her meticulously organized paperwork held securely in a folder in her free hand. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, almost imperceptible hiss, releasing a welcome wave of air-conditioned comfort that provided immediate relief from the relentless Texas heat. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the controlled activity characteristic of a bustling military administrative center. Soldiers in crisp, immaculately pressed uniforms moved purposefully between offices, their conversations conducted in the clipped professional tones that Laura remembered so distinctly from her own years of service. Behind the main desk, a young specialist worked diligently at a computer terminal, his fingers flying expertly over the keyboard as he processed the endless stream of paperwork that kept the vast base functioning seamlessly. Laura approached the desk and calmly placed her folder on the counter, waiting patiently for the specialist to acknowledge her presence. When he finally looked up, she saw the brief flicker of assessment that every military member learned to perform automatically: age, bearing, and purpose. She was clearly older than most visitors, yet there was something in her posture that suggested a profound familiarity with military protocols. "I'm Laura West," she stated, her voice carrying the clear, concise diction of someone accustomed to being heard and readily understood. "I have an appointment with Sergeant Major Ramos regarding the medical training support contract." Specialist Reed, whose name tag she now noticed, pulled up her file on his computer and began the diligent process of verification. As he worked, Laura became acutely aware of other eyes in the lobby studying her with varying degrees of curiosity. A small group of junior officers stood near the bulletin board, their conversation momentarily pausing as they took precise note of her presence. She could hear fragments of their hushed discussion, speculation about contractors, questions about qualifications. The kind of professional curiosity that was entirely natural within a military environment. "Ma'am, I show your appointment is confirmed," Specialist Reed stated, his gaze flitting between his screen and Laura's identification. However, I need to address the uniform issue. Base policy explicitly requires that only active duty personnel wear military utilities on the installation. I'll need you to change into civilian attire before proceeding to your meeting. Laura felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as conversations quieted and attention focused intently on the interaction at the desk. She looked down at her faded BDUs, understanding the regulation perfectly, but also recognizing the awkward position it created. These weren't dress uniforms or ceremonial garb. They were practical field clothing, chosen for their familiarity and comfort during what promised to be a physically demanding training assignment. "I understand the regulation," Laura replied evenly, her voice betraying no frustration. "I brought civilian clothes as a backup. Is there a place where I can change?" Before Specialist Reed could offer a reply, Lieutenant Shane Bishop stepped forward from where he had been observing the exchange near the officer's bulletin board. He was young, probably in his late 20s, with the crisp, immaculate bearing of someone who took regulations very seriously and expected others to adhere to them without question. His uniform was spotless, every detail perfect, and he carried himself with the inherent confidence of an officer completely comfortable exercising his authority. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Bishop," he announced, his tone polite yet undeniably firm. "While I appreciate your understanding of the regulation, I need to address this immediately. Base policy is unequivocally clear about unauthorized uniform wear, and I cannot allow you to proceed further onto the installation while in violation." Laura nodded, acknowledging both the lieutenant's authority and his clear responsibility to enforce base regulations. She had anticipated that this might become an issue and had, in fact, prepared accordingly. "Of course, Lieutenant," she responded, her voice steady. "As I mentioned to the specialist, I have civilian clothes with me. If you could direct me to an appropriate changing facility, I'll take care of, this right away." Lieutenant Bishop's expression softened slightly at her cooperative attitude, but his voice remained official. "There's a restroom down the hall that you can use. However, I want to be clear that this isn't just about convenience. Military uniforms represent something significant, and they should only be worn by those who have earned that right through active service." The words hung in the air like a subtle challenge, though Laura sensed they weren't intended as a personal attack. Lieutenant Bishop was merely doing his job, enforcing regulations that existed for sound reasons. Yet she also detected an undertone that suggested he might be making assumptions about her background and qualifications that weren't necessarily accurate. "I understand completely," Laura said, maintaining her calm demeanor. "The uniform does represent something significant, and I have great respect for that tradition." As she turned toward the hallway Lieutenant Bishop had indicated, Laura was acutely aware of the attention her situation had drawn from others in the lobby. Some watched with obvious curiosity, others with the detached interest of people witnessing a minor administrative drama. A few seemed to be waiting to see how the situation would resolve itself, as if her response to the lieutenant's directive would reveal something important about her character. Laura found the restroom and placed her duffel bag on the small bench inside. As she began to change out of her BDUs and into the civilian clothes she had brought as backup, she reflected on the deep irony of the situation. These faded utilities had been with her through some of the most challenging, life-altering moments of her military career. And now, They were being treated as if they represented stolen valor rather than being earned through years of dedicated service. The civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a simple polo shirt felt foreign after the familiar weight and texture of her military utilities. As she carefully folded the BDUs and placed them precisely in her duffel bag, Laura caught a brief glimpse of herself in the restroom mirror. She looked like any other middle-aged contractor reporting for a consulting assignment, which, in truth, was exactly what she was supposed to be. When she emerged from the restroom, the lobby had largely returned to its normal rhythm of activity. Lieutenant Bishop nodded approvingly at her civilian attire, and Specialist Reed completed her check-in process with professional efficiency. As Laura prepared to proceed to her meeting with Sergeant Major Ramos, she carried with her the keen awareness that this initial interaction had set a distinct tone, one that would likely influence how others on the base perceived her role and qualifications. The morning was still young, and Fort Blackhawk stretched out before her like a landscape teeming with possibilities and unforeseen challenges. Laura West had indeed returned to the military world as a civilian, but the profound memories and defining experiences that shaped her remained as undeniably present as the scars etched onto her hands, and the quiet knowledge that some stories were too important to remain buried in classified files. Sergeant Major Gloria Ramos stood behind her desk like an unyielding fortress of authority, her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she intently studied the woman seated across from her. At 39, Gloria had earned her formidable position through 2 decades of unwavering dedication to training excellence, and her office vividly reflected that profound commitment. The walls were meticulously lined with commendation certificates, numerous unit photographs, and the kind of military memorabilia that told countless stories without uttering a single word. The morning light, streaming sharply through Venetian blinds, cast angular shadows across her face as she reviewed Laura West's contractor file for the 3rd time that week. "Your credentials are undeniably impressive," Gloria stated, settling into her chair with the measured, deliberate movements of someone who understood that every gesture carried significant weight. "Combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, advanced trauma certification, 3 deployments to Afghanistan between 2007 and 2010. What I don't see here is why someone with your extensive background chose to leave active duty." Laura shifted slightly in her chair, instantly recognizing the probing nature of the question. She had, in fact, anticipated this very conversation. It was only natural for military leadership to seek to understand the motivations of civilian contractors, especially those possessing such extensive combat experience. "Personal reasons, Sergeant Major. Family obligations that required me to return to civilian life." The answer was technically accurate, yet deliberately incomplete, and both women tacitly understood the firm boundaries it established. Gloria nodded, making a swift note in the file before closing it with a decisive snap. "Fair enough. What truly matters now is what you can bring to our training program. These young medics are good, eager, dedicated, technically proficient. But most of them have never seen real combat, never had to make life or death decisions under fire. That's where experience becomes absolutely invaluable." Laura readily agreed. "Training scenarios can certainly simulate the technical aspects of trauma care, but they can't replicate the intense psychological pressure of working on wounded soldiers while under enemy fire." Gloria's expression softened almost imperceptibly, revealing a fleeting glimpse of the mentor beneath the stern military exterior. "Exactly. Colonel Chase has given me broad authority to design this training program, and I want it to be something that genuinely prepares these kids for what they might actually face downrange. Book learning only goes so far. Through the office window, Laura could clearly see the sprawling complex of Fort Blackhawk's medical training facilities. Modern buildings housed sophisticated simulation equipment meticulously designed to recreate battlefield conditions. But she knew from deeply personal experience that no amount of advanced technology could ever fully prepare someone for the raw reality of working on a critically wounded colleague while incoming rounds cracked menacingly overhead. That kind of preparation required a different type of education, one that could only be provided by someone who had truly lived through those harrowing moments. "I've reviewed the curriculum you sent," Laura said, pulling a folder from her bag. "The technical components are solid, but I'd like to suggest some modifications to the scenario-based training. Real combat situations rarely follow textbook procedures." Gloria leaned forward, her interest clearly and fully engaged. "What kind of modifications?" "Chaos factors," Laura replied without hesitation. "Multiple casualties arriving simultaneously, equipment failures at critical moments, communication breakdowns with command. In my experience, medics who can maintain focus and effectiveness when everything goes catastrophically wrong are the ones who save lives when it matters most." Their focused conversation was abruptly interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Gloria called out permission to enter, and Corporal Luke Gray stepped into the office with the purposeful, efficient stride of a soldier carrying important information. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from being exceptionally good at his job and knowing it. His uniform was impeccably crisp, his bearing professional. Yet Laura noticed something in his eyes that suggested he was constantly evaluating, constantly measuring the people around him. "Sergeant Major, Colonel Chase asked me to deliver this," Luke said, extending a sealed envelope toward Gloria's desk. His gaze flicked briefly to Laura, taking in her civilian attire with the kind of assessing glance that she had become accustomed to receiving from active duty personnel. Gloria accepted the envelope and quickly scanned its contents before setting it aside. "Thank you, Corporal. Have you met our new training consultant, Laura West? This is Corporal Gray. He'll be one of the senior medics participating in your advanced training program." Luke stepped forward and extended his hand with practiced military courtesy. "Ma'am, pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to working with you." His handshake was firm, professional, but Laura detected a subtle reservation in his manner. Not hostility exactly, but the kind of cautious evaluation that younger soldiers often applied to civilian contractors. "Likewise, Corporal," Laura replied, her voice calm and even. "Sergeant Major Ramos tells me you have excellent technical skills. That's going to be important for some of the scenarios we'll be running." "I appreciate that, ma'am," Luke said, his gaze fixed on her. "If you don't mind me asking, what's your background in combat medicine? I mean, I know you're here as a contractor, but I'm curious about your field experience." The question was reasonable, even expected. But Laura sensed something deeper beneath the surface. A challenge, perhaps. Or simply the natural skepticism of a soldier who had worked incredibly hard to develop his expertise and wanted to ensure that his instructors had earned their authority through genuine, battle-tested experience, rather than just classroom knowledge. Gloria intervened smoothly. "Ms. West has extensive deployment experience, Corporal. I'm confident Chefe me email. Holbazemi saero brawe yesiros emenesi yong. That bank valuable perspective to the training program. Luke nodded, accepting the redirect with military discipline, but Laura could clearly see that her deliberately vague credentials had only intensified his curiosity. Of course, Sergeant Major. I'm just eager to learn from someone with real-world experience. After Luke left the office, Gloria turned back to Laura with an expression that suggested she had noticed the subtle dynamics of the exchange. You're going to face that kind of scrutiny from some of the younger soldiers. They're good kids, but they've been raised in an era where information is easily accessible, and they expect transparency about qualifications and background. I understand, Laura said. It's natural for them to want to know who they're learning from. I'll do my best to earn their respect through the quality of the training rather than through stories about the past. Gloria stood and moved to the window, looking out at the sprawling training facilities where groups of soldiers were already conducting morning exercises. There's something else we need to discuss. The nature of your previous assignments means that certain aspects of your service record remain classified. I've been briefed on the general outline, but even I don't have access to specific operational details. Laura felt a familiar tension settle in her shoulders. The classified nature of her special operations assignments had been both a source of profound pride and a constant, quiet burden throughout her military career. The missions that had defined her service, the critical moments when her skills had made the difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers, were precisely the experiences that she could never discuss openly. I'm comfortable working within those constraints, Laura stated. The important thing is that the training be effective, not that anyone know the specific details of where or how I learned these techniques. Gloria nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. I respect that, and I'll support whatever boundaries you need to maintain. But you should be aware that some people on this base are going to be curious about gaps in your record, especially if you demonstrate capabilities that seem inconsistent with the information that's publicly available. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy, yet Laura fully understood its underlying implications. Military communities were small, interconnected networks where information traveled quickly, and speculation invariably filled the gaps where facts were absent. Her presence as a civilian contractor with an obviously extensive but mysteriously vague military background would inevitably generate questions and theories. I appreciate the heads up, Laura said. I've dealt with similar situations before. The key is to let the work speak for itself. Gloria returned to her desk and pulled out a training schedule that had been marked up with handwritten notes and revisions. Let's focus on the practical details. Your first session is scheduled for tomorrow morning with a group of 12 advanced medics. They've all completed basic trauma training, but they're preparing for deployment, so they need to be ready for anything. Laura reviewed the schedule, noting the progression from basic refresher courses through increasingly complex scenario-based training. The program was meticulously designed, building systematically toward the kind of high-pressure, multi-casualty situations that defined combat medicine. This looks good. I'd like to add some elements focusing on decision-making under extreme stress and techniques for maintaining clarity when everything seems to be falling apart. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd bring to the program, Gloria said, a rare hint of enthusiasm in her voice. These soldiers are technically competent, but they need to understand that competence under classroom conditions doesn't necessarily translate to effectiveness in combat. As their meeting concluded, Laura gathered her materials, preparing to begin the complex process of translating her hard-won experience into lessons that could be taught without revealing the specific, classified circumstances in which they had been learned. She understood that the coming days would require her to navigate carefully between the genuine desire to prepare these young soldiers for the harsh realities they might face and the absolute necessity of protecting information that remained classified years after the events that had generated it. Walking across the base toward her temporary quarters, Laura was keenly conscious of the attention her presence continued to draw. Soldiers who passed her in the corridors offered polite nods and professional greetings, but she could unmistakably sense the undercurrent of curiosity that her civilian status generated among people accustomed to clearly defined hierarchies and easily identified roles. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the vast sky in breathtaking shades of orange and gold. It reminded Laura of other sunsets in other far-off places where the stark beauty of the landscape had provided a haunting contrast to the brutal realities of war. Tomorrow would bring her first opportunity to share some of what she had learned in those places, filtered through the careful constraints of security protocols, but enriched by the profound knowledge that preparation and rigorous training could mean the ultimate difference between soldiers coming home and soldiers being tragically remembered. That evening, as Laura reviewed her training materials in the quiet solitude of her quarters, she allowed herself to remember some of the faces that had profoundly motivated her return to military training. Young medics she had worked with downrange. Soldiers whose quick thinking and steady hands had saved countless lives under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. If she could help prepare the next generation to carry that vital legacy forward, the complex navigation of classified information and civilian contractor protocols would undoubtedly be worth whatever challenges they might bring. The Fort Blackhawk mess hall buzzed with the familiar cacophony of military life at breakfast, metal trays clattering against steam. The Fort Blackhawk mess hall buzzed with the familiar cacophony of military life at breakfast. Metal trays clattered against steam tables, the rhythmic chop of industrial food preparation echoed, and hundreds of conversations blended into a steady hum of voices. Laura West moved through the serving line with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated countless military dining facilities, selecting coffee that looked strong enough to dissolve paint and oatmeal that promised sustenance over flavor. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating tables where soldiers clustered according to the invisible hierarchies that subtly governed military social dynamics. She found an empty table near the windows, preferring the relative isolation to the complex navigation of inserting herself into established groups. As she settled into her seat with her tray, Laura became acutely aware of the subtle shift in conversation patterns that her presence seemed to generate. Nearby tables grew quieter, voices dropped to more discreet levels, and she caught fragments of speculation about the new civilian contractor who had somehow earned access to advanced medical training programs. "That's her," someone whispered from a table of junior enlisted soldiers. "Gray said she's got some kind of classified background, but nobody knows what." Laura focused on her breakfast, long accustomed to being the subject of military gossip. In her experience, curiosity about new personnel was natural and usually harmless. Soldiers were inherently trained to be observant, and the appearance of anyone whose role wasn't immediately obvious would inevitably generate questions and theories. A few tables away, Private First Class Maria Guerrero sat with a group of medics preparing for deployment, her breakfast forgotten as she listened intently to the speculation surrounding Laura West. At 20, Maria possessed the kind of focused intensity that marked soldiers who took their responsibility seriously. She had volunteered for combat medic training against the earnest advice of family members who worried about the dangers. But Maria deeply understood that her skills could mean the ultimate difference between life and death for her fellow soldiers. "I heard she used to be Special Operations," whispered Private Brittany Cox, leaning forward conspiratorially. "But when Lieutenant Bishop made her change out of those old BDUs yesterday, she didn't argue or make a scene. Seemed like someone who understands how the system works." Maria glanced toward Laura's table, studying the older woman's posture and bearing. There was something about the way Laura held herself, alert, yet relaxed, keenly aware of her surroundings without appearing paranoid, that strongly suggested genuine, deep-seated military experience. "Maybe we should ask her ourselves instead of speculating," Maria suggested. "Right," snorted Corporal Luke Gray from the adjacent table, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that Laura could hear the sarcasm, though his words were ostensibly directed at his own table companions. "Because civilian contractors are always eager to discuss their mysterious pasts with random soldiers," Laura continued, eating methodically, giving no indication that she had noticed the conversation. She had learned long ago that responding to every provocation or attempt to draw her into defending her credentials only invited more scrutiny. Better to let her work speak for itself and allow curious soldiers to reach their own conclusions based on observation rather than speculation. The dynamics of the mess hall reflected broader patterns that Laura recognized from her own extensive military service. The younger soldiers, especially those who had not yet deployed, often carried themselves with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty that manifested as a skepticism toward anyone whose qualifications weren't immediately apparent. It was a natural defense mechanism in an environment where expertise could literally be a matter of life and death. Questioning credentials was not just acceptable, but absolutely necessary. Staff Sergeant Dan Murphy entered the mess hall with the purposeful stride of someone operating on a tight schedule. At 35, he had the weathered appearance of a career soldier who had seen multiple deployments and profoundly understood the value of experience over theory. His eyes swept the dining area with automatic assessment before settling precisely on Laura's table. Something in his expression shifted. Not recognition exactly, but a kind of focused attention that suggested he was seeing something that others had missed. Dan collected his breakfast and approached Laura's table with deliberate casualness. "Mind if I join you? These places get crowded fast, and I noticed you found the good spot by the windows." Laura gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Please have a seat. I'm Laura West, civilian contractor working with the medical training program." "Dan Murphy, equipment and supply," he replied, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone managing old injuries. "I heard you were coming in to work with their medics. That's good. They can use all the real-world perspective they can get." The comment was delivered casually, but Laura sensed something deeper beneath the surface. A probing quality that suggested Dan Murphy was evaluating her responses as much as simply making conversation. She had encountered this before with senior NCOs who had developed finely tuned instincts for assessing personnel. "Experience is valuable," Laura agreed. "But every deployment, every situation is different. The best training prepares soldiers to adapt and think critically, rather than just following predetermined procedures. Dan nodded, sipping his coffee while meticulously studying Laura's face. That's true. I've seen medics who were technically perfect in training completely fall apart when things got chaotic downrange. And I've seen others who maybe weren't textbook perfect, but had something else. Some kind of calm under pressure that you can't really teach. It comes from exposure, Laura said carefully. The more challenging situation someone has worked through, the better they become at maintaining focus when everything seems to be falling apart. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Karen Burns, who approached their table with the brisk efficiency that characterized her approach to most professional interactions. At 34, Karen had built a solid reputation as one of Fort Blackhawk's most competent medical officers, combining impressive technical expertise with the kind of leadership skills that inspired confidence in the most stressful situations. "Miss West, I'm Captain Burns from the Medical Training Division," she said, extending her hand. "I wanted to introduce myself before your first session this morning and see if you needed anything to get started." Laura shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested both confidence and professionalism. "Thank you, Captain. I've reviewed the training materials, and everything looks well organized. I'm looking forward to working with your medics." Karen pulled an empty chair from a nearby table and joined the conversation. "I've been reviewing your proposed modifications to the curriculum. The emphasis on decision-making under stress is exactly what we need. Too many of our training scenarios assume ideal conditions that rarely exist in real combat situations." "That's been my experience as well," Laura replied. "The soldiers who perform best under pressure are usually the ones who have learned to work effectively when communications are down, equipment isn't functioning properly, and they're dealing with more casualties than they have resources to handle." Dan set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Sounds like you've had some experience with those kinds of situations. Not many people understand just how fast things can go sideways when you're dealing with multiple wounded soldiers and limited resources." Laura met his gaze steadily. "I have had some experience, yes. Enough to know that the difference between effective training and academic exercise is often the presence of realistic stressors that force people to think on their feet." Karen leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly engaged. "What kind of stressors do you recommend? We have simulation equipment that can replicate various environmental conditions, but I'm always looking for ways to make the training more realistic." "Time pressure is crucial," Laura said. "In real situations, medics rarely have the luxury of taking their time to consider all options. Adding artificial time constraints forces trainees to make decisions quickly and live with the consequences." "Equipment failures," Dan added, nodding appreciatively. "Nothing teaches improvisation like having your primary medical kit malfunction when you need it most." Laura smiled slightly. "Exactly. And communication breakdowns. Scenarios where medics have to work without clear direction from command or coordinate with units using different communication protocols." The conversation was developing a natural rhythm when it was interrupted by the approach of Master Sergeant Ray Collins, whose weathered face and measured gait spoke to decades of military service. At 58, Ray had become something of an institutional memory at Fort Blackhawk, the kind of senior NCO who had seen enough changes in military culture and training to provide invaluable perspective on what worked and what didn't. "Morning, folks," Ray said, nodding toward the group. "Couldn't help but overhear your discussion about realistic training scenarios. That's music to my ears. I've been saying for years that we need to prepare soldiers for the chaos of real operations, not just textbook situations." Karen gestured toward an empty chair. "Master Sergeant Collins, meet Laura West, our new training consultant. She's been sharing some ideas about adding stressors to our medical training scenarios." Ray studied Laura with the kind of assessing gaze that came from years of evaluating personnel. "Miss West, pleasure to meet you. What's your background in military medicine?" The question was direct, but not confrontational. Simply the natural inquiry of a senior soldier who wanted to understand the qualifications of someone who would be training his medics. Laura had anticipated this moment and had prepared a response that would satisfy professional curiosity without revealing classified information. "I served as a combat medic for several years, with deployments to Afghanistan," she said. "After leaving active duty, I worked in civilian emergency medicine before transitioning to training and consultation work." Ray nodded slowly, processing the information. "Afghanistan, huh? What years were you deployed?" 2007 to 2010, Laura replied, keeping her tone neutral and factual. Something flickered across Ray's expression. Not recognition exactly, but a sharpening of attention that suggested the time frame had triggered some memory or association. He was quiet for a moment, seemingly lost in thought, before returning his focus to the conversation. "Those were challenging years," he said finally. "A lot of good soldiers served during that period, and many of them have valuable experience to share with the next generation." The comment seemed to mark the end of his direct questioning, but Laura sensed that Master Sergeant Collins was filing away information for future consideration. She had encountered this before with senior NCOs who had extensive networks of contacts and the kind of institutional memory that allowed them to piece together fragments of information that might seem disconnected to others. As the breakfast conversation continued, Laura became acutely aware that their table had become a focal point of attention throughout the mess hall. Other soldiers were clearly listening to fragments of their discussion, and she could see phones appearing at nearby tables, as social media posts were undoubtedly being crafted to share observations about the mysterious civilian contractor and her apparently extensive military background. The morning light was growing stronger, signaling the approach of the duty day, and Laura's first training session with Fort Blackhawk's advanced medics. As she prepared to leave the mess hall, she carried with her the keen awareness that her first 24 hours on base had established patterns that would likely define her entire assignment. Curiosity about her background, skepticism about her qualifications, and the kind of careful evaluation that characterized military communities when faced with outsiders who claimed expertise in life-or-death skills. The Combat Medic Training Center at Fort Blackhawk stood as a monument to modern military medical education, its sleek exterior housing simulation labs that could replicate any battlefield environment, from harsh desert operations to complex urban warfare. Laura West approached the main entrance at precisely 0800 hours. Her civilian clothes, practical and professional dark cargo pants, a moisture-wicking polo shirt, and sturdy boots that could handle whatever physical demands the training might require, spoke to a readiness for serious work. In her hands, she carried a worn leather medical bag that had seen service in places where improvisation meant the crucial difference between saving lives and writing casualty reports. Inside the main training bay, 12 soldiers stood in formation, waiting for her arrival. They Sati represented the cream of Fort Blackhawk's combat medics, hand-selected by Sergeant Major Ramos for advanced training based on their exceptional technical skills, clear leadership potential, and upcoming deployment schedules. Laura could see the mixture of anticipation and skepticism in their faces as she entered the room, the natural reaction of professionals who had worked hard to develop their expertise and wanted to ensure that any additional training would be truly worth their valuable time. Private. Perkama spatter sepris. Aniors neiri kletter fracco. Maria Guerrero stood at attention in the front row, her medical kit arranged with the precise organization that characterized soldiers who took their responsibilities seriously. Beside her, Corporal Luke Gray maintained his impeccable professional bearing while his eyes meticulously tracked Laura's every movement, with the kind of assessment that would later be shared in group chats and informal conversations. The other medics, a mix of junior enlisted soldiers and experienced NCOs, displayed varying degrees of curiosity about the civilian contractor who had somehow earned the authority to train them in advanced combat medicine. "At ease," Laura said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in high-pressure situations. "I'm Laura West, and for the next 2 weeks, I'll be working with you to enhance your trauma care capabilities under combat conditions." She moved to the front of the room with economical steps, placing her worn medical bag on the central table where it would be clearly visible to all the trainees. "Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules. First, everything we do here is designed to prepare you for situations where perfect conditions don't exist and textbook procedures might not be sufficient. Second, I expect you to challenge assumptions, including mine, if you think there's a better way to approach a problem." Sergeant First Class Juan Herrera, a veteran medic with 2 previous deployments, raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's your background in combat medicine? I mean, we've all heard different stories about your experience, but it would help to know what kind of situations you've actually worked in." The question was reasonable and delivered with professional courtesy, but Laura recognized the underlying challenge. These soldiers had invested significant time and effort in developing their medical skills, and they deserved to know that their instructor possessed genuine expertise rather than just theoretical knowledge. "I served as a combat medic in Afghanistan from 2007 to 2010, Laura replied, maintaining direct eye contact with Herrera. "During that time, I worked in various capacities: forward operating bases, convoy support, and some specialized assignments that I can't discuss in detail due to classification restrictions." Luke Gray shifted slightly, his expression suggesting that the deliberately vague reference to classified assignments had only increased his skepticism. "With respect, ma'am, a lot of people served in Afghanistan during those years. What makes your experience particularly relevant to advanced trauma training?" Laura nodded, acknowledging the legitimacy of his concern. "Fair question, Corporal. Rather than telling you about my experience, let me show you. We're going to start with a scenario that will demonstrate some of the challenges you might face downrange." She moved to a control panel that operated the training-based simulation equipment with practiced efficiency. Laura programmed a complex scenario involving multiple casualties, equipment failures, and communications disruptions. The room's lighting dimmed to replicate the limited visibility of dawn operations, while speakers began generating the ambient noise of helicopter rotors and distant explosions. "Your unit has just taken casualties from an IED strike," Laura announced, her voice cutting through the simulated chaos. "You have 4 wounded soldiers, limited medical supplies, and your primary communication equipment has been damaged. Your medevac helicopter is 15 minutes out, but weather conditions are deteriorating." 4 training mannequins, each equipped with realistic wound simulators, were positioned around the room, each presenting different types of trauma that required immediate medical intervention. The immediate complexity of the scenario was apparent. No single medic could possibly handle all 4 casualties simultaneously, requiring the team to prioritize, delegate, and coordinate their efforts under extreme time pressure. "Guerrero, Gray, you take the soldiers with chest and abdominal trauma," Laura directed. "Herrera, Cox, handle the traumatic amputations. Everyone else, establish a casualty collection point and prepare for medevac arrival." The medics sprang into action with the disciplined efficiency of their training, but within minutes, the inherent limitations of textbook procedures became glaringly apparent. The simulated equipment failures that Laura had programmed into the scenario meant that standard medical devices malfunctioned at the most critical moments, forcing the teams to improvise solutions using whatever limited resources were available. Maria Guerrero found herself working on a mannequin representing a soldier with a penetrating chest wound, but her primary suction device failed just as she was attempting to clear the airway. For a brief moment, she hesitated, her rigorous training having emphasized the absolute importance of proper equipment for such delicate procedures. "What are you going to do, Guerrero?" Laura called out, moving seamlessly between the teams to observe their responses to the escalating challenges. "I need to clear this airway, but my suction equipment isn't working," Maria replied, frustration clearly evident in her voice. "So, what's your backup plan?" Laura asked, her tone firm but encouraging. "In real combat, equipment fails constantly. You need to be able to adapt." Maria looked around the simulated battlefield, her mind racing through alternative approaches. Finally, she grabbed a water bottle from her pack and began using it to flush the airway manually. It wasn't a textbook procedure, but it was an effective improvisation given the dire circumstances. "Good thinking," Laura said approvingly. "Perfect equipment is a luxury that you rarely have in real combat situations." Meanwhile, Luke Gray was struggling with his own equipment failure. The pressure bandages he desperately needed to control hemorrhaging on his casualty had been programmed to malfunction, leaving him with inadequate materials to stop life-threatening bleeding. His initial response was to call for additional supplies, but Laura's scenario design meant that no additional resources were available. "Time is running out, Gray," Laura announced. "Your casualty is bleeding out and medevac is still 10 minutes away. What's your solution?" Luke's jaw tightened with frustration. "I need proper pressure bandages to control this hemorrhaging. Without the right equipment, I can't effectively treat this wound." Laura approached his position, kneeling beside the mannequin. "Show me what you've tried so far." Luke demonstrated his attempts to control the bleeding using the materials that were available, but his approach remained rigidly focused on textbook procedures that required specific equipment. Laura could see that his technical knowledge was excellent, but his ability to improvise solutions was severely limited by his strict adherence to established protocols. "Watch this," Laura said, taking over the mannequin. using materials that Luke had previously dismissed as inadequate. Torn clothing, improvised pressure points, and remarkably creative bandaging techniques, she demonstrated precisely how to achieve effective hemorrhage control without access to standard medical supplies. The other medics paused in their own urgent work to observe Laura's technique. Her movements were fluid and supremely confident, displaying the kind of muscle memory that came from extensive real-world experience. She wasn't just demonstrating alternative procedures. She was showing them how to think creatively under immense pressure. The key is understanding the underlying physiology, Laura explained as she worked. If you know why a particular technique works, you can adapt it to whatever materials you have available. As the scenario continued, Laura introduced additional complications designed to test the medic's ability to maintain effectiveness under increasing stress. Communications equipment failed completely, forcing teams to coordinate using hand signals. Weather conditions in the simulation deteriorated further, adding severe time pressure as the medevac window grew critically shorter. Sergeant First Class Herrera, working diligently on a traumatic amputation, found his confidence growing as he adapted to the rapidly changing conditions. The initial equipment failures had forced him to abandon rigid, procedural thinking and focus instead on achieving results with whatever resources were available. "This is actually more realistic than our usual training scenarios," he admitted to his partner, Private Cox. Brittany Cox nodded, sweat beading on her forehead from the intense physical and mental demands of the exercise. "It's definitely more stressful, but I can see how this kind of training would prepare us better for real deployments." Laura continued to move between the teams, offering precise guidance and introducing new complications that forced the medics to continuously adapt their approaches. She could visibly see that the initial skepticism was beginning to give way to genuine respect as the soldiers recognized the profound value of training that challenged their ingrained assumptions and pushed them far beyond their comfort zones. The 15-minute scenario felt like an hour to the participants, but as the simulated medevac helicopter arrived and the intense exercise concluded, Laura could see that something fundamental had shifted in the group's dynamic. The medics who had begun the session, questioning her qualifications, were now looking at her with the kind of focused attention that only genuine, demonstrated expertise commanded. "Debrief in 5 minutes," Laura announced, giving the soldiers time to secure their equipment and mentally process what they had just experienced. "I want to hear what you learned and what questions you have about adapting standard procedures to non-standard situations." As the medics gathered around the central table, Laura noticed that their body language had changed, subtly. They were no longer viewing her as an outsider whose credentials needed to be verified, but as an instructor whose knowledge had been definitively demonstrated through practical application. The shift was gradual, but unmistakable. The kind of profound respect that had to be earned rather than simply assigned. Private First Class Maria Guerrero was the first to speak during the debrief. "Ma'am, that improvised airway clearing technique, is that something you learned from field manuals or from actual experience?" Laura met her gaze steadily. "Experience. Field manuals are written by people who assume you'll have access to proper equipment and ideal conditions. Real combat rarely provides either." The session had decisively established Laura's credibility in a way that no amount of discussion about classified assignments could have achieved. These soldiers had seen her demonstrate skills that went far beyond textbook knowledge, and they understood that such expertise could only come from extensive practical application under the kind of intense pressure that no simulation could fully replicate. The afternoon heat pressed down on Fort Blackhawk like a suffocating blanket, transforming the outdoor training area into a furnace that tested the endurance of even the most seasoned soldiers. Laura West stood beside the casualty evacuation course, watching as her medics prepared for their second training session of the day. The morning's indoor scenarios had firmly established